Chocky by John Wyndham is a story of a very unusual alien visitation to Earth. It's mediated through the mind of an 11-year-old boy called Matthew. It was first published in Amazing Stories in 1963 as a novella. It features on the back cover. Here's Matthew trying to persuade Chocky to leave him alone when he's ill. And there's also a nice illustration, or several nice illustrations here, of an event during the story when Chocky helps Matthew save his sister, and also at the beginning of the story when we get a great illustration that would have looked good on a book cover even. I also have a first edition book club edition of the book. The history of Chocky has shaped the way that Wyndham wrote the novel, and it comes with what I consider as a number of decisions that he made about how to write it that I don't think present the story in the best possible way that it could have been. And I want to describe those now. I'll warn you, though, that this is going to be a spoiler heavy discussion of the book. And so if you haven't read it, I would thoroughly recommend you go away and read it. You won't be disappointed. And it's a very short book as well. It's about 150 pages. And so it can be read very quickly. And then come back and then see whether you agree or disagree about some of they're not shortcomings, but choices that Wyndham made about how to present the story of this young boy who becomes a conduit to an alien civilization somewhere else in the galaxy, or even further away. Who knows? The first issue with the book is that we know almost immediately what's going on with Matthew. And it doesn't take long for his father to work this out either, although his mother is more resistant to the idea that Matthew is a conduit to this alien civilization. I think that Wyndham would have been much better served if he'd raised the stakes at the beginning, or at least the tension, and not have it be quite so clear what's going on with Matthew. And he could have done this in a number of ways. One of the features that Matthew shows that he's more than just himself is he gains the ability to paint in a peculiar and interesting style. And that could have been used as a clue that something had changed inside Matthew. Also, he wouldn't necessarily have had to spend a lot of time in discussion with himself out loud to reveal what was going on inside his mind. That could have been hidden, I think, for a little bit longer before revealing what's going on. Now, I think the reason why Wyndham jumped in feet first is that he was writing a novella for a science fiction magazine, and so he had to get to the crux of the tension in the plot very quickly. The crux of the tension at the beginning of the story is between Matthew and principally his parents and principally his mother. His father is more curious about what's going on, but his mother is concerned. Obviously, being his mother, she wants her son to be perfect, normal, happy child, even though he's adopted. And so she's concerned when he seems to have this other inner voice, which is expressing ideas that don't make sense or can't easily be explained. And so I think Wyndham had to get to that tension quickly. But I think the novel would have been better if Wyndham had taken a slower approach. A second, more significant problem, at least from my perspective, is the inclusion of a new episode in the novel which doesn't appear in the short story published in Amazing Stories. And that's a kidnapping that occurs towards the end of the novel. Matthew's mother feels that Matthew needs to see a psychologist to try and explain away these voices in Matthew's head. And this psychologist falls foul of Matthew's mother. She's unsatisfied with his analysis of her son. In essence, he believes what Matthew says. And so she encourages her husband, Matthew's dad, to look for another psychologist who might analyze Matthew and try and work out what's wrong with the boy, ignoring what is obvious to us as the reader now, that he's clearly in communication with an alien entity somewhere far away in the galaxy. This second psychologist uses hypnotism to try and determine the veracity of Matthew's story. He then comes back and tells Matthew's parents that he believes that the story is simply a creation of Matthew's, either subconsciously or consciously, and that he's taken things he's heard from other parents, from TV shows, maybe even from speculative fiction, and use this to create this inner narrative, and there is no communication with an alien entity. But in fact, he clearly must have passed this information on to the powers that be in the United Kingdom, and Matthew is kidnapped and drugged and interrogated to discover everything that he's learned from this alien. Now, one of the clever features that Wyndham uses in the story is the fact that Matthew is only 11, and so he simply doesn't understand many of the concepts that this alien entity is explaining to him. And so Matthew can't be a conduit for some incredible scientific advance that might change planet Earth, simply because he just can't explain it. And that's what saves Matthew in the end from this dark turn in the plot that Wyndham makes. One of the ways he tries and explains away the kidnapping is that it's done by good people. This is the opinion of Matthew's father and the doctor who looks at Matthew after he's returned from this kidnapping event. We never actually learn who the kidnappers were. But the idea that you could have a good kidnapping of a small boy of 11 and that he would be drugged and then interrogated, of course, is utterly ridiculous. Wyndham skips over this episode to come to a much more pleasant ending that relates to an earlier event in the novel where Matthew saves his sister, as per the picture I showed you earlier on, from a possible drowning event. And I don't think Wyndham wanted to grapple with the implications that Matthew could become a pawn or a victim of people who might be afraid of the kind of information he might provide, say, people who make weapons, who might be concerned or want to have the information that Matthew could get from this alien entity. Wyndham didn't want to turn the novel down that course, and so avoided that problem altogether. Which brings me to the thought that if you were to make a screenplay of this, there's lots of opportunity to expand this darker ending that Wyndham doesn't want to grapple with. And in fact, it has been done. An ITV series was made of Chocky. There were 2 subsequent seasons where the scriptwriter did explore the consequences of Matthew potentially being a provider of information that could radically change the way life on Earth goes on, specifically in terms of the energy we use and what the consequences of that would be for him. I've looked at a few episodes of that ITV series and it doesn't look particularly good. It's also true that Spielberg apparently has the rights for the movie and he could tackle such a thing if he was to make it. Although I personally wouldn't want Spielberg to make a movie of this because he would give it much too much of a childish gloss, as he does with a lot of his movies. And a different director could give it a much darker tone, I think. Anyway, in conclusion, this is a really great book, and if you've read it already, you'll know that. And the reason how it's written is because it was written initially as a novella to be published in a magazine, and so it was space constrained. And then later on, the novel was published not long before Wyndham's death. And my theory is that it wasn't space constrained anymore, but it was time constrained. And Wyndham didn't have the time to change the story radically, especially the ending, to take into account this idea that Matthew might become a victim of his connection with this alien entity.